Happy Friday, everybody. It is Terra Firma Live with Share More Stories. I'm James Warren, the founder and CEO of Share More Stories, and I am excited to once again be joined by Breland Hillman from Share More Stories and JMI, the marketing and communications group based here in Richmond that we partner with on a lot of things. So, Breland, what's up? How you doing?
Pretty good. Definitely happy it's Friday. We had a full week to say the least, but got a lot accomplished. Still got a lot to do. So looking forward to a rainy folk festival, excuse me. Although,
Okay, that's right. I forgot. Yeah, Folk Festival is back this weekend. So if you are in anywhere of driving distance from Richmond, or as we like to call it, RVA, you might want to head down because it is one of the most interesting, diverse, and really just so many different genres and groups of people. It's amazing artists, amazing connection with the Richmond community and region. So, and it's a great point. And I think you're also right. It's been a week.
mhm,
We've gotten. I love your point. We've gotten a lot done this week, though. It's been a very full week, both at SMS and JMI, and that's something to be grateful for because it means we are doing good work.
yeah, yeah.
Um, any particular highlights from the week that you wanna recollect?
Uh, and as you know, we've been working a lot on the Big Dipper side, and so um, we've started to lay out some of the brand architecture, both for the summit, but kind of the overall brand that we're hoping to roll out sooner rather than later. So it's cool to kind of see things that have been in our collective heads start to take shape in a way that's a little bit more accessible. And then marrying that with a more operationalized vision is kind of the next step challenge. So definitely good substantive work to work on, but I think starting to delineate
Yeah.
and make it more succinct has been cool, especially given that this time last year I didn't know what a Big Dipper was, and now it occupies a large portion of my schedule.
Yeah, my week was highlighted, like we said, a number of good things this week, but one of the highlights for me was being at the EUCI conference. It was a conference focused on the energy sector in general, but more specifically public utilities, and really focused on um, how they engage the public, communities, stakeholders. And it was great to be able to present there, share some of the work we do at Share More Stories and at JMI around helping clients and customers understand those stakeholders in a deeper way, understand the communities they're interacting with. Sometimes those relationships are positive and strong, sometimes they're not. But either way, you got to get to the bottom of it so you can develop a path forward. So that was cool. And I think that kind of almost relates a little bit to our topic of assumptions today. Um, and that's what we're talking about, folks. We're talking about assumptions, and y'all have heard the jokes. But this is about making assumptions, challenging them, testing them, and learning our way to greater clarity as we gather data and insight. And as we usually do, we're going to unpack a customer story in a little bit around assumptions tested and what was learned as a result of that. But before we get into that, just a little, some thoughts from you, Breland. When you think about assumptions, we make assumptions all the time. That's the reality. That's part of the human nature. So, can you tell us about a time when you found yourself making an assumption, and maybe it turned out to be wrong, or it turned out to have an impact, and how did you navigate that?
Yeah, I think I could go a few different angles, but I'll bring in my other passion, which is basketball officiating. And so,
Okay, definitely.
yeah, you learn very quickly, or you're taught early on, if you don't know, don't blow. And the reason why that is basketball is fast paced in a game of angles, and so sometimes we can react to, someone falling down or perhaps someone flopping, or you might be anticipating something will happen and you put air in your whistle, and you can decide not to blow your whistle, but once you do, there's no coming back from that. So,
And you have stakeholders in
exactly.
that process
So,
too.
depending on who the stakeholders are, where if they're very young, you got grandma yelling at you, auntie, uncles, and everyone. Or if you're, on the college side where there's a little bit higher stakes, whether you're right or wrong, it doesn't really matter. But I think, kind of just if I speak around that, and then I can kind of touch on something more personal, I think it just teaches you the importance of one, having a disciplined system to make the right decisions, but two, you've got to have the proper preparation in place to be prepared to be in the right position, and kind of not assume something happened or assume something will happen, because it is a very lonely feeling when you make the wrong assumption. But I think on the more personal side, no specific examples come to mind, but as you mature, you learn that judging people often comes with making the wrong assumptions, and
Mm.
the cost can be, a relationship or an opportunity. And so, I think, if I'm assuming right where this conversation is going, that's probably a more relevant example for
No, no, man. I love the basketball one because, first of all, the reason why I love having these conversations with the team is I'll always learn some new language or frame of how you all see the world based on your other passions, pursuits, etc. And yes, I mean I know how much basketball officiating is so integral to who you are and how you show up in the community, and how you cultivate your passion. And I love when you weave learnings and lessons from basketball into your work. And you said two things: a game of angles, which I was like, that's really interesting. Like a game of angles, which to me is about perspectives and where are you seeing this from? Are you seeing this from this sideline or that sideline or the baseline? Which goes back to what we talk about, the value of collecting stories from different voices and perspectives. It gives you the full picture. It's the antidote maybe to assumptions, is story gathering, story sharing. And that can happen on a very micro level where you're like, all right, hold on, let me confer with the other refs. Or sometimes you're getting that feedback in game from the players who are asking you to pay attention to something. The other phrase I heard you say was, you put air in the whistle, and I was like, oh, okay, air in the whistle. Let's see if I can work these into some Zooms next week. Much to your chagrin, I'm sure. But it's gonna be like,
it.
James,
No.
let it
Yeah.
go.
So maybe my initial example is a little bit more relevant, because it's very much when I was thinking a game of angles, I was thinking more on a micro where I'm looking, but it's very easy to be in the crowd, especially if you know
Mm,
what you're looking for and see everything, because you have a big picture view. And so we're actually trained to have, a big picture view, and so you see everything, but call locally.
oof,
So I think,
layers, levels.
so if you're thinking about kind of personal relationships or even managing an organization, you can have that big picture view, which can have its benefits, but you might not see the guy tug the jersey when the
Yeah,
guy's trying to roll through. And so there's value in having both perspectives. And there's also, if you're just one person out there, where early in my career, when you're refereeing the ankle biters, you've got to, I used to get dropped off in gyms all up 95, and it's just you in there, and they called it leadership training, where it's you and everyone, and that's kind of your initial, all right, am I willing to continue to move on? But
mm,
quickly learn, even with little kids, did he step out of bounds? I don't know. From here, I can tell if he got fouled pretty much from everywhere, but knowing kind of where those boundaries and those limits are. So there's definitely a parallel with life
yeah.
lessons, but also work as well, which is, I always appreciate finding transferable skills, whether that's a JMI, whether it's basketball, share more stories, or just experiences in general.
That's awesome, man. I should also mention, if you were tuning in today hoping to find our compatriot Kevin Levin, he is unfortunately unable to make this due to some unforeseen circumstances, but he's all good, and we're all good. But we are keeping on in his absence. I do want to move to one of the customer stories that we talked about, but in a minute, let me just share one of my examples of making an assumption. And you know, I think part of this conversation is about realizing how much we make assumptions, and also realizing that there are tools available to us to either train ourselves to make less assumptions or to lessen the impact of those assumptions, or to just test them and to challenge them and to find out, hey, making an assumption is a mental shortcut. It's a way to say, I think I've seen this before, and I think I know what this means. And you might be right. You also might not be. And it's about reducing the impact of not being right when you are making an assumption, and instead saying, hey, if that assumption is well founded, if it's insightful, if it's experience based, test it, expand on it, build on it, go from I think to I believe to I know. And one of the assumptions I made, which I'm not, it was, I don't want to say embarrassing, but I was like, wow, no matter where we come from in this work, all of us are subject to this. And we were working on a project with a customer who is a management consulting firm. And we may have already shared this story, and if not, it'll be in an upcoming episode. So I won't get into all the weeds, but it was about imposter syndrome. And every time I've heard imposter syndrome from my lived experience, I have thought about it primarily through the lenses of women and people of color, just being real. That doesn't mean other people don't have it. I'm saying that's what I've always heard about it from the people in my life who described it to me were predominantly of those two populations. And so when a person who was neither a woman nor a person of color was telling us that they believed everybody had imposter syndrome, I was like, how's that even possible? Like, some of you represent the thing that some of us are feeling we need to be imposters, that are making us or having us feel like we need to be imposters to navigate. And it was fascinating to me because that was my assumption on at work, that I had a belief that I'm sure many people also would share. So it doesn't mean it was like out there or random, but it was incomplete. And that's the point, because when we met with their employees and listened to people of all different backgrounds, all different genders, all different races and ethnicities, and all different tenures in the organization, I was shocked at how many people legitimately exhibited imposter syndrome, which was not only about the context of coming from a excluded or marginalized or overlooked or unheard community. It was also about being in situations where, despite all evidence to the contrary, you felt you were not ready for the job or capable of the job or prepared, even though factually speaking you were. And that's the textbook definition. And so I was like, wow, this is my assumption that this only applies to some of us, when in truth, a lot more of us had navigated it. I have other thoughts about how, depending on what we have in our lives in terms of privileges and resources, we can minimize the impact of that feeling, or we have tools to navigate that feeling, but that's a different convo for a different day. So go
Real
ahead.
quick, it's almost, as you were speaking, and I'm just thinking about, it's almost like there's a spectrum of assumptions where you might have more passive ones just based on your experiences that you're relatively open to shifting, with new information. And then you might have more reactionary if we look at kind of either local politics or national or geopolitics at large, where people have more embedded beliefs, and regardless of what they hear, they have a more closed view. But then in a lot of our work, you can have informed assumptions where it's more about from a space of curiosity, and you're probably the most open, and that can yield the most learning, in my opinion. So
No, I love that. And I think that's a great frame because, it is, again, we all make them. We all have assumptions about lots of things in life. It's part of the mental shortcut to just making efficient sense of the world. But like you said, there's a spectrum, and it could be either keeping us closed from things or it could be opening us up to things. And I think sometimes it's about stating those assumptions. We do that a lot in our work. Like, what are the assumptions? Just naming them and identifying them and putting them on the table is crucial because then you can test them, then you can challenge them. You can say, is that, it's an assumption right now. Is it either a hypothesis or is it a fact? Is it knowable? And if it's a hypothesis, let's go explore it. If it's a fact, let's move on. And so, briefly, let's share and open it up to a story that we had. One of our customers is a manufacturing company, and what they were really trying to do on really a national and global basis is explore the context of being included in their company. And this is a company with a really strong culture, deep pride. And so there's always that feeling when you have those type of cultures that people are really, really engaged and really bought in, and that could be an assumption. There's also the belief that sometimes if we are saying and doing things that are part of our goals for inclusion and diversity and equity, that people see those things, they hear those things, and they either believe it or they align with it. And that can be an assumption. And so, to this company's credit, what they really focused on was, let's move beyond our assumptions and let's start to understand the real experiences of our employees. And so they asked us to conduct a series of our Seek sessions using our Seek app technology to hear stories of employees across a diverse set of job experiences, from hourly employees in manufacturing to, people in salary positions, all different types of jobs and departments, and importantly, all different types of tenures, experiences with the company, different lived identities and experiences. And what was fascinating in that process was to learn. I won't get into the details of that company because, again, we don't tell our companies' names in these stories. But what was fascinating in their experience was understanding how a more inclusive environment really unleashed the possibilities for greater collaboration. And not just we talk about inclusion equals collaboration. I mean, like tangible, tactile, deep experiences of times when I felt included. This is what we could do as a team. And some of those things reinforced things that they already knew and believed as a company, and said, yes, these elements of what we think is happening in our employee experience are in fact happening. And some of it revealed either nuances or, to your point, differences that they had not previously considered or processed. And I think that speaks to that point of kind of curiosity that you say, which is, being willing and open to say, hey, we have these metrics and we see these things and we know everything's not great, but we think it's headed in the right direction. Well, the real question here is, what do your stakeholders think? And in this case, the stakeholders were the employees. What do they think about the path you're on, the rate of progress, the impact of decisions? It doesn't mean that every time your stakeholders tell you this is what they think, that's what you must go do. But if you're making all of your decisions based on your assumptions of what your key stakeholders, whether they be employees or customers or community members, think and believe, instead of knowing what they think and believe, the gap between getting it close to right and getting it close to wrong just kind of widens, and you're just sort of closing your eyes and throwing a dart. So I think one of the things that I took away from that particular experience was the customer's willingness to challenge their own assumptions about their rate of progress, to bring data and insight to the conversation, not just some of the behavioral or demographic metrics that many companies rely on when it comes to saying, hey, we're making progress in diversity and inclusion, TBD on equity, but moving beyond that type of conversation to, well, what does the lived experience of our employees and other constituents tell us? What does that look like in terms of where we are or where we're going? And so I'm just curious, zooming out and maybe thinking about it more big picture, when you think about, businesses in general, especially as you've done a lot of work engaging stakeholders and communities, what do you think is the pitfall, if you will? What's the challenge in, making assumptions or navigating the assumptions they have? How do they work through that from your point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big challenge is there's always a level of urgency that sometimes you might not prioritize taking the time to listen. And so on the front end, it might save you some time, but very often, whether it's the loss of the employee or the stakeholder or the loss of trust, it can be very costly. And so, I mean, I think um, if there's an opportunity to increase awareness around how much people appreciate being heard. And
Mm,
so, from more traditional methods like surveys, that doesn't give them, to use one of your words, the opportunity to uncork. But if we think back to the experience that you're alluding to, there was a couple times where people, made it very clear that they had a lot to say, even before we took them through kind of our traditional story process. So, I mean, I think one, just reprioritizing the power of listening and
mm.
being heard, because you can't take every input and apply it, but at least being mindful of it allows you to communicate more clearly around the path that you ultimately choose.
No, I love that. Reprioritizing the power of listening is huge. I mean, again, I think these are the antidotes to faulty assumptions. Is being adopting a stance that says I must go out immediately upon having these assumptions and find out if they're true, and find out from the people whom I'm making these assumptions about if these assumptions are true, if what I believe is their experience is in fact their experience. And it reminds me of some of the work we're starting to do with startups and companies in the healthcare tech space or the fintech space, where they're founders of early stage companies or product managers of companies that are a little bit further along in their journey, or even innovators and researchers who are trying to change the company from within. And that whole process is one of identifying, making assumptions, challenging them, testing them, learning from the results. That process of sort of validated learning, where we explore what we either believe is true or what we think is true, and find out if it in fact is true. And I think that's a lot of where I think the CCAP process and methodology can help companies today. Is it's a way of testing your assumptions by asking people to tell you their stories. And like we always say, focusing more on what they want to say than what you want to hear is the sort of mental, and I would even say emotional frame that you have to approach this work with. Because we often want to go, we seek out information that confirms our assumptions. We seek out information that aligns with our biases and our preferences, because again, we're looking for mental shortcuts to make sense of the world around us. And the curious mind says that might not be true. And in fact, I'm going to go, maybe not, maybe actively try to disprove it, or at least go find out, are there other alternate explanations for this, or are there other alternate pathways for this? And I just love what you're saying about the power of listening and tying that into curiosity. I guess my last question for you then, when you think about companies trying to create more inclusive cultures and organizations, how does assumption making derail that process? And what can they do to, I don't know if re-rail it is right, but what can they do to get back on track?
Yeah, I mean, I think number one, realizing that it's not a speedboat, it's a cruise liner. And so you have to appreciate those small turns, but not rest in your laurels.
Metaphor points there. Metaphor points. That's good. That's good. Keep
Um,
going. Keep going.
I stole it from a famous lawyer, but I think it often. I won't speak to the client because that would derail the conversation. But and that was in more so in the context of kind of social justice as a whole, where especially I think as we mature or as you're growing, you might expect everything to be able to turn around in 1 setting, but given all the different perspectives and people that you're impacting, you have to be very intentional and methodical in making those changes. But it's really important to consider all those perspectives. Where, from my street corner, if you will, I think about the Black experience and those who are underrepresented. But if we're thinking about an organization and all the different priorities that they have to serve, you can't just pull one lever, because there could be backlash, and then you even worsen current experiences. And so, I mean, I think really it's a tough question to answer, and I think something that takes collective figuring it out on an ongoing basis. But really, kind of first starting with what's that vision of success, and then backing into what is the work that we can do that's impact focused, not activity oriented, that to move forward. And definitely don't be too quick to pat yourself on the back, because it's really a journey that should be embedded with the work that you're ultimately doing, and that embedding process as well as enhancement process takes time.
Yeah. No, I mean, one of the things you just illuminated is the assumption that we are making the right progress at all times, and you know, adopting that posture of staying open, staying curious, staying humble in the learning journey, I think is really crucial, because it allows us, again, room to see our assumptions for what they are, to decide if we're going to test them and challenge them, to raise and sort of identify new questions. And, by centering the stories and the experiences, the voices of the people you are trying to serve, whether it's your employees, your customers, your stakeholders, others around you, again, your risk, it never goes to zero, but your risks go down, because you are anchoring your decision making in the perspectives, wants, needs, values, the things we identify out in the analytics and the CCAP. You're rooting your decisions in human experience insights, which I think, when it comes to making decisions about humans, is a heck of a lot more valuable than just trusting clicks and percentages alone. So I think this is really about how do we take some of those things we do today to understand our audiences, rich data around behaviors and sentiment and demographics, and add this layer of, but what's their experience? How do they feel about it? What do they value? What do they need? And let that be the frame that helps us interpret some of these other things we think we know. So again, we're making less assumptions instead of more. And I think that would make a whole lot of things at least a little bit better. Well, this has been great. And again, I love how you took this conversation into a few really interesting and different places and spaces. So thank you for that. And I guess that's all we have for today. Anything you got coming up besides Folk Festival for the weekend?
So the clinics, preseason clinics for all the conferences are wrapped. So scrimmages kick off this weekend. So actually, I'm assuming I know what that sweatshirt says, but I'll be at Union this weekend, which will be cool. And
Yes.
For I picked up the CIAA. So for a lot of reasons, I'm excited about that, primarily from just like a African American history standpoint. And so then it's just managing the calendar and juggling all the things. So
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I have a similarly full and experience laden weekend ahead, which I'm looking forward to as well. So thanks again, Breland, for your time. And thank you all for tuning in and sharing some space with us as we talk about assumptions and how we challenge them and how we improve based on what we learn from them. And if you want to know more about how we're helping companies navigate these journeys of learning, of improving experiences for their stakeholders, hit us up. You can hit us up in a DM in any of these pages you're watching this from or profiles, or go to sharemorestories.com and hit us up and contact us. Thank you all so much for your time, and have a great weekend. Bye.